Imagine this. The phone rings, you pick it up, and on the other end is a voice you haven't heard in years. A voice you thought was silenced forever. The voice of someone you buried. This story delves into themes that some listeners may find unsettling, including psychological distress and the unknown. Listener discretion is advised. It was a Tuesday, a suffocatingly hot Tuesday in late August, when Ethan Miller found the answering machine. Not just any answering machine, but the ancient beige clunky relic that had sat on his grandma Eleanor Vance's kitchen counter for as long as he could remember. It was the kind with actual cassette tapes, a small red LED display, and buttons that clicked with satisfying mechanical finality. Eleanor, bless her heart, had stubbornly refused to upgrade to anything digital, clinging to her rotary phone and her cassette player like they were extensions of her own memory. And now her memory was all Ethan had left. Eleanor had passed away 6 weeks prior. Not suddenly, not violently, but with the quiet, gradual fading that often accompanies 92 years of life. A peaceful passing, everyone said. A blessed end. Ethan, her only grandchild, had been tasked with the monumental, heartbreaking job of clearing out her old Victorian home in Willow Creek, a town that felt perpetually stuck in a Norman Rockwell painting. Every antique teacup, every meticulously embroidered doily, every faded photograph in that house was a fresh stab of grief. He'd spent weeks sifting through decades of a life, each item a silent testament to a woman he adored. He was in the kitchen, wiping down the sticky residue left by years of Eleanor's baking experiments, when he spotted it, tucked away behind a stack of cookbooks. The answering machine. He almost tossed it into the donate pile without a second thought. Who even used these anymore? But then a strange impulse, a whisper of nostalgia, made him pick it up. It felt heavy, substantial, a tangible link to a bygone era. He noticed the tiny message light was blinking, a faint, insistent glow like a distant lighthouse. One message. After all this time, after the house had been empty for weeks, after Eleanor herself was gone, there was still a message. Curiosity, a potent cocktail of grief and morbid fascination, seized him. He plugged it into an outlet near the counter, the familiar hum of the old machine a ghostly echo in the silent house. His finger hovered over the play button. He expected nothing. A telemarketer, probably. An old friend of Eleanor's who hadn't heard the news. Maybe static. He pressed it. The machine word clicked and then a voice. A voice that sent a jolt of ice through his veins, freezing him mid-breath. It was Eleanor. His grandma Eleanor. Clear as day, a little raspy but undeniably her. "Ethan," she began, her voice a soft, almost hesitant whisper. "Ethan, darling, it's me. I know this is going to sound strange, but I need you to listen very carefully. Don't tell anyone. Not yet. Just listen." Ethan stood there, his hand still on the machine. His mind a frantic scramble of disbelief and terror. This was impossible. Eleanor was dead. He'd seen her, held her hand in the hospital bed. He'd attended her funeral. He'd delivered her eulogy. He'd scattered her ashes by the old oak tree in the town park, just as she'd requested. He knew with absolute certainty that she was gone. Yet here she was, speaking to him from an answering machine in a house that had been empty for over a month. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the house. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Was this a sick joke? Had someone recorded her voice and planted it? But who? And why? Eleanor had no enemies, no one who would play such a cruel, elaborate prank. And the voice, it wasn't just a sound-alike. It was her. The subtle inflection she used when she was serious, the slight tremor that came with age, the way she pronounced his name. It was also perfectly terrifyingly Eleanor. He leaned closer to the machine, his breath catching in his throat, desperate to hear the rest, yet terrified of what it might say. His eyes darted around the kitchen, as if expecting to see her materialize in her favorite apron, a knowing twinkle in her eye. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, making the familiar kitchen feel alien, charged with an unseen presence. "There are things," Eleanor's voice continued, a new urgency creeping in. "Things I couldn't tell you before. Things about this house, about our family, about what's hidden. You need to find it, Ethan. Before they do. They're watching. Always watching." The message cut off abruptly, replaced by the mechanical click of the tape rewinding. Silence. a profound, echoing silence that felt heavier than before. Ethan stared at the machine, his mind reeling. They? Watching? What on earth was she talking about? This wasn't some cryptic dying wish. This sounded like a desperate warning. A warning from beyond the grave. He tried to play the message again, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, but the machine just whirred emptily. The red light was off. It was as if the message had never existed. A phantom voice in the air. He tried rewinding, fast-forwarding, pressing play again and again, but nothing. Only the low hum of the machine and the relentless ticking of the old kitchen clock. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping tendril that wrapped around his heart. He wasn't just hearing things, was he? He hadn't imagined it. He remembered every word, every nuance of her voice. This wasn't grief playing tricks on him. This was real, and it was terrifying. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over his best friend David's contact. David, a pragmatic engineer, would tell him he was overtired, stressed, probably hallucinating from the heat. He'd make a logical explanation out of it, ground Ethan back in reality. But then Eleanor's words echoed in his head. Don't tell anyone. Not yet. Why? What was so dangerous that she would warn him from the afterlife? His grandmother had always been a bit eccentric, a storyteller, prone to dramatic flair. But not like this. Never like this. She was grounded, sensible, despite her love for old mysteries and ghost stories. This wasn't a story. This felt like a confession, a desperate plea. He looked around the kitchen again, his gaze lingering on the closed pantry door, the dusty shelves, the antique hutch filled with Eleanor's porcelain dolls. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the old house more sinister. He felt an intense, undeniable sensation of being observed, not just by the ghosts of memory, but by something else, something living and malevolent. They're watching. Who were they? And what was hidden? The house itself, once a comforting sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets, each corner holding a potential trap. He thought about the weeks he'd already spent in the house, sifting through everything. He hadn't found anything out of the ordinary, no hidden compartments, no cryptic notes. Just a lifetime of collected treasures and trinkets. But Eleanor's message implied something far more significant than a dusty diary. Before they do, it suggested urgency, danger. And the fact that she had chosen this impossible, terrifying way to communicate, it meant whatever she was trying to tell him was critical. Life or death, perhaps. Ethan took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm the frantic pounding in his chest. He was an accountant, for crying out loud. His life was spreadsheets and tax forms, not supernatural mysteries and cryptic warnings from the dead. But the voice, the message, the impossible reality of it, had shattered his predictable world. He couldn't dismiss it. He wouldn't. Not when it was Eleanor. He knew with a horrifying certainty that his task of clearing out his grandmother's house had just changed irrevocably. It wasn't about sorting memories anymore. It was about uncovering a truth so profound and dangerous that his grandmother had reached out from beyond the veil to deliver it. He had to find out what she meant. He had to find what was hidden. And he had to do it alone, just as she had instructed. The silence of the house pressed in on him, no longer comforting but menacing. He was no longer alone in this house, and he was no longer safe. The words echoed in the sudden, profound quiet of the living room, a chilling aftertaste to a message from beyond the grave. Asterisk, you are not safe. Asterisk, Michael's blood ran cold, a visceral dread tightening his chest. He stood frozen, the answering machine's tiny red light blinking innocently, a stark contrast to the terror now gripping him. He was alone, utterly alone, in the house of his recently deceased Aunt Carol, but the message insisted he wasn't. He spun around, eyes darting, scanning the familiar, antique-filled room. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every creak of the old house settling sounded like footsteps. Had he left the back door unlocked? Was that a whisper of wind, or something else brushing against the window pane? His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. He wasn't just scared. He was being told explicitly that a tangible threat existed. Michael forced himself to move, his legs feeling heavy, like he was wading through thick mud. He walked to the front door, checking the deadbolt, then to the windows, ensuring they were latched. He moved through the downstairs, a methodical panic circuit, verifying every possible entry point. The kitchen, the dining room, the small sunroom at the back. All secure. Yet, the feeling persisted. an icy prickle on the back of his neck, the undeniable sensation of being watched. He knew with a certainty that transcended logic that the threat wasn't in the house yet. It was around it, waiting. He returned to the living room, his gaze falling once more on the answering machine. Aunt Carol, always so precise, so deliberate. A retired librarian, she lived a life of quiet order, surrounded by books and the comforting scent of old paper. She wasn't prone to dramatics, certainly not to posthumous warnings of danger. This wasn't some morbid joke. This was real. And if Carol, in her final moments, had gone to such extraordinary lengths to deliver this message, then what she was trying to protect, what she needed him to find, must be monumental. Asterisk, find what's hidden, Michael. And do it alone. Asterisk. The instruction was clear if terrifyingly vague. What could a meticulous, mild-mannered librarian possibly have hidden that would put her, and now him, in such grave peril? His mind raced, replaying conversations, sifting through memories of Carol. She loved puzzles, riddles, the intellectual challenge of a good mystery novel. Her house was a testament to her passions, bookshelves overflowing, antique maps rolled in tubes, a collection of curious trinkets from her travels. His eyes fell on the grand mahogany study just off the living room, its double doors slightly ajar. It was her sanctuary, her private world. If anything was hidden, truly hidden, it would be in there. He pushed the doors open, the scent of aged paper and leather enveloping him. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, packed with thousands of volumes. A massive oak desk dominated the center, covered in stacks of neatly organized papers, journals, and a half-finished crossword puzzle. This was where she spent most of her waking hours. This was where he had to start. He began his search at the desk, meticulously sifting through every drawer. He found utility bills, old tax documents, letters from distant relatives, photographs, a lifetime of mundane existence. Nothing out of place, nothing hinting at a secret. He checked under the desk blotter, inside the pencil holder, even beneath the old rotary phone. Nothing. Next, the bookshelves. Michael felt a wave of despair wash over him. How could he possibly search thousands of books? It would take weeks. He needed a system, a clue, something to narrow down the impossible task. He closed his eyes, trying to channel Carol, imagining how she would approach such a task. She wouldn't just hide something randomly. It would be logical, perhaps even poetic, given her love for literature. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. Carol, years ago, showing him a first edition of The Great Gatsby, a cherished gift from her own father. She had spoken of its unique binding, a subtle imperfection that only a keen eye would notice. She had kept it not with her other fiction, but in a special locked glass cabinet in the study, alongside other rare and valuable editions. He walked to the cabinet, his gaze sweeping over the rows of leather-bound and cloth-covered treasures. There it was, on the second shelf, nestled between a worn copy of Moby Dick and a beautifully illustrated Alice in Wonderland. The familiar green cover of The Great Gatsby. He remembered the cabinet was always locked. Carol had the key on her usual keyring. He'd seen it in her purse, which the funeral director had returned to him along with her other personal effects. He hurried back to the living room, rummaged through her worn leather purse, and found the small ornate brass key. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted it into the cabinet lock. With a soft click, the glass door swung open. He carefully extracted The Great Gatsby, its pages brittle with age. He held the book, running his thumb over the spine, feeling for any irregularities. He opened it, leafing through the delicate pages, his eyes scanning for loose inserts, highlighted passages, or hidden compartments. Nothing. Seemed to be just a book. A very old, very valuable book. Disappointment began to set in, but then he remembered something else Carol had told him years ago, when he was a boy fascinated by spy novels. She'd said the best hiding places were often the most obvious, or the ones that required a specific, non-obvious interaction. She'd shown him how some old books had secret hollows, or how a spine could be carefully removed and replaced. He examined the book more closely, turning it over in his hands. The binding was indeed unique, a slightly darker shade of green on the spine. He pressed along the edges, feeling for anything unusual. And then his fingers brushed against something. Not a hollow, but a faint, almost imperceptible seam along the very bottom edge of the spine, near the binding. It was too perfect, too precise to be a manufacturing defect. He gently, carefully tried to pry it open. Nothing. It was sealed tight. He remembered Carol's meticulous nature, her patience. He needed to be equally patient. He tried twisting, pushing, applying pressure in different ways. And then with a barely audible click, a tiny, almost invisible compartment, no bigger than a matchbox, slid open from the bottom of the spine. His breath hitched. He stared at the minuscule opening, a mixture of awe and growing terror. Inside, nestled in a velvet lining, was not a key or a map, but a single perfectly preserved antique silver locket. It was tarnished with age, unadorned, and felt surprisingly heavy in his palm. It had no chain, no inscription, just a simple, smooth oval. He tried to open it, pressing on the hinge, but it remained stubbornly shut. It wasn't designed to be easily opened. It was a puzzle in itself. He felt a shiver run down his spine, unrelated to the chill of the old house. The locket radiated an almost palpable sense of history, of secrets. As he held the locket, a sudden sharp rap echoed from the front door. Not a polite knock, but a jarring, insistent pound that made him jump. His heart leaped into his throat. He froze, the locket clutched tight in his hand. He wasn't expecting anyone. Who would be here at this hour pounding like that? And why now, just as he was making a breakthrough? The message replayed in his mind. Asterisk, you are not safe. Asterisk. He instinctively moved away from the study doors, pressing himself against the wall, out of sight. He heard another, louder series of knocks, followed by the distinct sound of the doorknob rattling. Someone was trying to get in. His blood ran cold. He hadn't told anyone he was staying at Carol's. Only the lawyer knew he was handling the estate, and he certainly wouldn't be showing up unannounced, let alone trying to force entry. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was the threat Carol had warned him about. They knew he was here. They knew he was looking. He peered cautiously through the crack in the study doors, his eyes fixed on the front door. The pounding stopped. A silence descended, heavier and more menacing than before. He held his breath, straining to hear any sound. Was that a footstep on the porch? A creak of the floorboards? Or was it just his own terrified imagination? Then a faint metallic scrape. It sounded like something was being inserted into the lock. Michael's eyes widened in horror. Someone was trying to pick the lock. He backed away from the door, his mind racing. He was trapped, alone. And whatever was hidden, whatever secret Carol had died protecting, it was now in his hand, and someone was coming to take it. He had to hide. He had to figure out what this locket meant. And he had to do it fast, before the front door gave way. The house, once a haven of quiet memories, was now a cage, and the hunter was at the door. The front door splintered with a groaning crack that echoed through the house like a gunshot. Michael's heart slammed against his ribs. There was no time to think, no time to analyze. Instinct, sharp and primal, seized him. The living room offered no escape, only a dead end. He spun, his gaze wild, landing on the narrow, unassuming door tucked beside the kitchen pantry, the basement. He bolted, the locket clenched tight in his sweaty palm. Heavy footsteps thudded on the porch, followed by the sickening crunch of wood giving way. The air behind him shimmered with the certainty of imminent breach. He flung open the basement door, revealing a gaping maw of darkness and cool, musty air. Without a second's hesitation, he plunged down the rickety wooden steps, each one protesting his weight with a shriek. The door above him slammed shut, not by his hand, but caught in the draft of his desperate descent. He didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't even breathe until his feet hit the damp concrete floor. He stumbled, catching himself on a stack of forgotten canning jars, their contents long since turned to shadowy memories. The basement was a subterranean tomb, filled with the ghosts of his grandmother's past. Archaic furniture shrouded in white sheets, boxes stacked like silent sentinels, the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and forgotten things. A single bare bulb dangled precariously from the ceiling, casting a weak, flickering glow that only intensified the shadows, making them dance with ill-defined menace. Above him, the house groaned. A loud crash, then the distinctive thud of heavy boots on the hardwood floor. They were inside. Michael pressed himself against the coolest, dampest wall, trying to melt into the shadows, straining his ears. Footsteps moved methodically, deliberately, across the living room, into the kitchen. Drawers were yanked open, cupboards rattled. They weren't just breaking in, they were searching. For what? For him? For the locket? His breath hitched, a ragged gasp caught in his throat. He had to be silent, utterly silent. He slid down the wall, crouching behind a massive, dust-covered chest, his knees bumping against its cold, rough wood. His heart hammered, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the basement. The locket felt heavy, a burning coal in his palm. He had to know. He had to know what it was, what it meant, why someone was willing to break down a door to get it. He risked a glance at the locket. It was crafted from an incredibly dark, almost obsidian-like metal, smooth and cool to the touch despite his frantic grip. It wasn't silver nor gold. It absorbed the dim light, offering no reflection. The intricate carvings around its edge, previously obscured by grime and the urgency of the moment, now stood out in stark relief. They weren't decorative swirls. They were symbols, small and precise, repeating in a strange, ancient-looking pattern. He tried to pry it open, digging his thumbnail into the seam. Nothing. He twisted, he squeezed. It was solid, sealed shut. Frustration mixed with rising panic. The sounds from upstairs intensified. A sharp crack, as if something ceramic had been smashed. They were tearing the place apart. Michael's fingers traced the locket's surface again, more carefully this time, searching for a hinge, a clasp, anything. His thumb brushed over a tiny, almost imperceptible indentation on the side, disguised by the intricate carvings. It wasn't a button, more like a pressure point. He pressed. With a faint, almost inaudible click, the locket sprang open. Inside, there were no faded photographs, no locks of hair. Instead, nestled in a shallow, velvet-lined recess, was a single, tightly folded piece of paper. It was impossibly small, no bigger than his thumbnail, and yellowed with age, its edges brittle. He carefully, painstakingly unfolded it. It felt like trying to unwrap a butterfly wing without damaging it. Under the faint, flickering light, he saw it. Not a message, not a name, but a series of cryptic markings. At the top, in faded, elegant script, were the numbers 10.26. Below that, a single word, stark and unsettling. The root. Michael stared at it, his mind racing. October 26? Was it a date? A birthday? An anniversary? His grandmother's birthday was in April. His own was in July. What about the root? It sounded like something from a puzzle, a riddle. Upstairs, the heavy thuds ceased. A horrifying silence descended, broken only by the frantic pounding of Michael's heart. Had they left? Were they listening? Or worse, were they coming down? He held his breath, straining his ears, hearing nothing but the distant hum of the house settling, the drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness of the basement. He risked a slow, agonizing peep over the top of the chest. The basement door, still closed, seemed to mock him. He had to move. He couldn't stay here, vulnerable, waiting to be found. But where to go? Where could the root lead him in this labyrinth of forgotten heirlooms? His gaze swept around the basement, searching for anything that might connect to the cryptic clue. Old gardening tools, dusty shelves laden with ancient preserves, a forgotten workbench littered with rusted hardware. Nothing. No prominent roots pushing through the concrete, no carvings of trees. Then, his eyes landed on an anomaly. In the far corner, almost completely obscured by a leaning stack of old newspapers and a defunct washing machine, was a section of the concrete wall that looked different. It wasn't the smooth, poured concrete of the rest of the foundation. It was rougher, darker, almost like stone, and integrated into it was a gnarled, twisted shape that resembled, unmistakably, the root system of an ancient tree, pushing its way through the very bedrock of the house. It was a carving, or perhaps a natural formation deliberately left exposed. "The root," he whispered, a tremor in his voice. He scrambled towards it, pushing aside the newspapers, the old machine scraping loudly against the concrete floor, making him wince. He froze, listening. Silence from above. He continued, his fingers tracing the cold, rough contours of the root-like formation. It was old, incredibly old, and felt strangely alive beneath his fingertips. He ran his hands along the root, searching, pressing, feeling for any further clue. His fingers brushed against a loose section, a small square panel no bigger than his palm, cleverly disguised within the intricate network of the carving. He pushed. It gave way with a soft, grinding sound, sliding inward to reveal a shallow, dark recess. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry, crumbling earth, was a small wooden box. It was old, handcrafted from dark, heavy wood, its surface worn smooth by time. There were no obvious locks, no hinges. It seemed to be a single seamless piece of wood expertly carved. Michael carefully extracted it, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilarating discovery. The box was heavier than it looked solid. He examined it, turning it over in his hands. He noticed tiny, almost invisible grooves on one side, arranged in a specific pattern. It was a combination lock, but not one with numbers. Instead, it was a series of small raised bumps and depressions. He looked back at the locket, then at the small piece of paper. 10.26. Not a date, perhaps. Maybe it was a combination. 10 bumps, then 26? He tried to interpret the numbering system, his mind racing. What if it wasn't a standard numerical sequence? What if it was a pattern? He carefully ran his finger along the grooves on the box, feeling for the raised bumps. There were several. He tried pressing the 10th bump, then the 26th, or what he interpreted as such. Nothing. He tried another interpretation, 1 press, then 0 presses, then 2 presses, then 6 presses. Still nothing. He stared at the 10.26 again, then at the locket. The locket had those repeating symbols around its edge. Could the numbers correspond to the symbols on the locket? His eyes flickered between the two objects. The symbols were indeed unique. There were several different symbols repeated around the locket's circumference. He counted them. There were exactly 10 distinct symbols. A jolt went through him. 10 for the 10th symbol, 26 for the position of that symbol in the sequence? Or was it simpler? 1 for the first symbol, 0 for how many times to press it? No, that made no sense. He looked at the tiny folded paper again. The numbers were distinct. 10.26. What if it was a direct sequence of presses? 1 press, then 0, then 2, then 6. He tried it on the raised bumps. He pressed the first bump once. Then he paused as if for 0. Then he pressed the second bump twice. Then the third bump 6 times. A soft, almost imperceptible click echoed in the silent basement. The top of the wooden box, which had seemed seamless, now shifted. A thin line appeared, and with a gentle push the lid slid open, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It looked like his grandmother's, yet the ornate, swirling script on the cover was unfamiliar. And tucked inside the journal's front cover, a single faded black and white photograph. He carefully picked up the photo. It showed his grandmother, much younger, her face radiant, but with a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. She wasn't alone. She stood with a group of 5 other people, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in old-fashioned, almost timeless clothing. They stood in front of a crumbling stone wall, overgrown with ivy, a place he didn't recognize. But what sent a chill down his spine was the detail that linked them all. Each person in the photograph, including his grandmother, wore an identical, dark, obsidian-like locket, just like the one he held in his hand. The locket in Michael's hand suddenly felt heavier, colder, an anchor dragging him into an unfamiliar past. His grandmother, smiling faintly in the faded photograph, looked nothing like the woman he knew, yet her eyes, even in the stillness of the print, held a familiar glint of secret wisdom. But it was the locket, identical in every detail to the one he clutched, adorning her neck and the necks of the other 5 individuals, that truly seized his attention. An obsidian-like stone, dark and smooth, reflecting no light, absorbing it instead. He pulled his gaze from the photograph, his eyes fixed on the locket in his palm. He'd barely given it a second thought until now, assuming it was a simple heirloom, a sentimental piece. But seeing it replicated on 6 other people, in a place called Waverly, a place that now felt ominous, shifted its meaning entirely. He ran his thumb over its cool, polished surface, searching for seams, clasps, anything that might suggest it was more than just a decorative pendant. It felt solid, seamless, almost impossibly smooth, like a single carved piece of stone. Yet, the photograph clearly showed it as a locket, with a distinct hinge and clasp. His own must have one too. Michael rotated it slowly, his fingers tracing every curve. He pressed gently, then harder, along what he thought might be a seam on one side, but found nothing. Frustration began to prickle at him. How could it be identical, yet so different in functionality? He held it up to the light, turning it this way and that, hoping to catch a reflection, a faint line, anything. The stone seemed to swallow the light, a miniature black hole in his hand. Then, almost by accident, as his thumb brushed over a tiny, almost imperceptible raised point on the locket's edge. He felt a faint click. It was so subtle he almost missed it, a whisper of sound that vibrated more through his fingertips than through the air. He froze, his breath catching. He looked down, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The locket, which minutes ago seemed impenetrable, now had a hairline crack running along its side, barely visible unless you knew where to look. With trembling fingers, he carefully pried it open. It didn't swing open like a typical locket. Instead, one half slid sideways, revealing a shallow, perfectly circular recess within. It wasn't empty. Nestled snugly inside, almost flush with the inner surface, was a minuscule, folded piece of paper. It was ancient, brittle, and yellowed with age, so thin it was almost translucent. Michael carefully extracted the paper with the very tip of his fingernail, his movements slow and deliberate, fearing it might crumble into dust at any moment. He unfolded it with painstaking care, his eyes straining to read the faded script. The handwriting was delicate, elegant, and unmistakably his grandmother's, though younger, firmer than the shaky script he'd seen in later years. It read, "Michael, if you are reading this, I am no longer here. The truth is hidden, protected by the very silence that surrounds it. They will say it was an accident, a natural end. Do not believe them. The message I left you will guide you, but only if you listen with your heart, not just your ears. The locket is more than a memory, it is a key. The others, they are gone. Waverly holds the answers, but it also holds the danger. Trust no one who speaks of the sacred order of the obsidian. They are the keepers of the lie. Find the whispering well. It remembers everything. Be brave, my dear boy. The time has come for the truth to surface. Asterisk. With all my love, always, Grandma Rose." The paper trembled in his hand, not from his own shaking, but from the sheer weight of its revelations. His grandmother's voice, clear and urgent, seemed to echo from the fragile page. Asterisk. They will say it was an accident, a natural end. Do not believe them. Asterisk. This wasn't just a cryptic clue, it was an accusation, a warning that shattered his understanding of her death. His grandmother hadn't simply passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had been taken, and she had known it. The words swirled in his mind. Sacred order of the obsidian. Whispering well. Waverly holds the answers, but it also holds the danger. Each phrase was a new thread in a rapidly unraveling tapestry, revealing a dark pattern he never knew existed. The locket wasn't just a key. It was the first piece of a puzzle, a direct line from her past to his present. He looked back at the photograph, his eyes scanning the faces, searching for any hint of the danger his grandmother spoke of. The 5 other individuals, all wearing identical lockets, now seemed less like strangers and more like fellow travelers on a perilous path. Who were they? Were they the others she mentioned, the ones who were gone? And what about Waverly? The name, initially just a place, now resonated with an unsettling chill. Michael pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. Waverly. He typed it into the search bar, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and desperate curiosity. The results populated almost instantly. There were towns, streets, even a few businesses named Waverly. But one result near the top caught his eye and sent a fresh jolt of ice through his veins. Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a history of hauntings and unexplained deaths. He clicked on it, his breath hitched in his throat. The article detailed a massive, Gothic-style sanatorium built in the early 20th century to combat tuberculosis. It spoke of experimental treatments, thousands of deaths, and a dark reputation that earned it the moniker, one of the most haunted places in America. The images showed a sprawling, decaying structure, its windows like empty eyes staring out from a forgotten past. It certainly looked like the kind of place that could hold danger. But the photograph didn't show the sanatorium. It showed a group of people standing in front of what looked like a much older, smaller stone building, partially obscured by overgrown ivy. It had a heavy, ornate wooden door and a single arched window. It didn't match the imposing institutional architecture of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. So not the sanatorium, but the name Waverly clearly pointed to something significant, something dark. He went back to the search results, refining his query. Waverly plus stone building plus locket. Nothing. Waverly plus whispering well. Again, nothing directly relevant, just vague references to wishing wells or natural springs in various locations. His grandmother's message specifically mentioned the sacred order of the obsidian. He typed that in. This time the results were sparse, almost non-existent. A few obscure forum posts, quickly dismissed as conspiracy theories or fictional cults. One post, however, deep within a forgotten corner of the internet, mentioned a small local historical society in a remote, almost forgotten town simply called Waverly. Not Waverly Hills, not Waverly Creek, just Waverly. And it mentioned an old, private collection of artifacts, some related to local folklore, and what the post vaguely described as ancient regional beliefs. This was a long shot, but it felt like the only lead. A historical society might have records, photographs, or even artifacts related to the group in his grandmother's picture. And if the Whispering Well was a specific landmark, perhaps it was tied to the history of that particular Waverly. The idea of traveling to this remote town, potentially hundreds of miles away, was daunting. He had a job, a life, responsibilities, but the image of his grandmother's face, her urgent plea from the locket, the chilling implication of her death, propelled him forward. He couldn't ignore this. He wouldn't ignore it. He carefully refolded the tiny note and placed it back inside the locket, snapping it shut with a decisive click. The locket was no longer just an heirloom. It was a compass, pointing him towards a truth he never knew he needed to uncover. His gaze fell back on the answering machine, its red light still blinking patiently. The distorted message, once merely a haunting echo, now felt like a direct command. "Find the truth, Michael." Her voice, crackling with static, seemed to gain new meaning. The urgency, the fear in her tone, was no longer just a trick of the recording. It was real. Very real. He knew what he had to do. He needed to go to Waverly. Not the sanatorium, but the small, forgotten town. He needed to find that historical society. He needed to find the Whispering Well. And he needed to understand what the sacred order of the obsidian truly was, and why his grandmother had dedicated her life, and perhaps even given it, to expose them. A cold certainty settled in his stomach. This wasn't merely a family secret. It was something far larger, far more dangerous. His grandmother hadn't just left him a message. She had passed him a torch, illuminating a path into a darkness he was completely unprepared for. The journey was about to begin, and he had a terrifying feeling that once he started, there would be no turning back. The silence of the house, which had once offered solace, now felt heavy with unspoken warnings, a prelude to the storm gathering on the horizon. He stared at the antique wooden box, its surface worn smooth by time and countless touches, yet now it seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, a silent challenge. His hand hovered, trembling slightly, before he finally took a deep breath, pushing past the rising tide of fear that threatened to drown his resolve. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. This was about Aunt Carol, about understanding the cryptic message, about the unsettling feeling that had burrowed deep into his bones. He had to know. With a click that echoed too loudly in the otherwise silent room, the ornate brass latch gave way. Michael slowly lifted the lid. The scent that wafted out was a peculiar mix of dried lavender, old paper, and something metallic, almost like forgotten coins. He peered inside, his heart thumping against his ribs. The box wasn't filled with treasure or anything immediately dramatic. Instead, it contained a carefully curated collection of mundane items that, in this context, felt profoundly unsettling. On top lay a stack of yellowed photographs face down. Beneath them, a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. There was a rusted skeleton key, its teeth sharp and angular, and a small leather-bound journal, its pages thick with the promise of untold stories. Tucked into one corner, almost out of sight, was a sealed envelope, addressed to him in Aunt Carol's familiar, elegant script. He picked up the journal first, its weight surprisingly substantial. The leather was soft, warm from the ambient temperature of the room, yet it felt cold in his hands, like a hand reaching out from the grave. He ran his thumb over the worn cover, resisting the urge to crack it open immediately. Instead, he set it aside, his gaze falling back to the photographs. He flipped the top photo over. It was an old snapshot of Aunt Carol, much younger, perhaps in her late 20s, laughing brightly on a beach, her arm linked with a man Michael didn't recognize. The man was tall, with a kind smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners. He looked vaguely familiar, but Michael couldn't place him. He flipped through a few more. Aunt Carol at various ages, always alone or with strangers. No family members. No parents, no hint of his own father, her brother. It solidified the image of her as a solitary figure, but the man in the first photo lingered in his mind. Then, his eyes landed on the envelope. For Michael it read, his name written by her hand, a final communication. He tore it open carefully, his fingers brushing against the thick paper. Inside there was a single sheet folded neatly. The letter was short, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, yet still unmistakably Carol's. Michael, it began. Asterisk, if you are reading this, then I am gone. And they have won a battle but not the war. I knew they would come for me eventually. I've been watching them just as they've been watching me. For years. They want what I found, what I unearthed. The truth. It's all in the journal. Every secret, every step, every warning. You must finish what I started. You are the only one I trust. The key is to a safety deposit box at the old First National Bank downtown. It contains something vital. Don't let them get their hands on it. Don't trust anyone. Not even those you think you know. They are everywhere. Be careful, Michael. For your sake. And for the truth. Asterisk. Carol. The words blurred before Michael's eyes. They have won a battle but not the war. They want what I found. Don't trust anyone. The letter was a jumble of paranoia and desperate pleas, yet a chilling clarity pierced through it all. Aunt Carol wasn't just eccentric. She was terrified, hunted. And now Michael was pulled into her terrifying world. The answering machine message, her trembling voice, the ominous warning. It all made a horrifying kind of sense. She wasn't just leaving a message. She was passing a torch. He looked at the rusted key, then back at the letter. The old First National Bank downtown. It had been closed for years, a historic landmark now, undergoing renovations to become something else, a boutique hotel perhaps. How could she have a safety deposit box there? Unless it was very old, predating its closure, and she'd maintained it. Or perhaps the key wasn't to a bank box at all. Perhaps it was a misdirection. His gaze returned to the leather journal, now imbued with a new terrifying significance. This was it, the heart of the mystery. He picked it up again, his fingers tracing the worn edges. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside was also Carol's, but much neater, more composed than the letter. It began as a typical diary, chronicling daily life, observations about her garden, her quiet routines. But as Michael flipped through the initial pages, a subtle shift occurred. Dates became less frequent, entries grew longer, and the tone darkened. August 14th, year redacted by Michael for privacy, but clearly years ago. Asterisk, another strange incident today. The same black car parked down the street for hours. I know I'm not imagining it. I've seen it before. Always just out of sight, always watching. It feels like a chill down my spine, even with the summer sun beating down. Am I becoming paranoid? Or is someone genuinely interested in my quiet life? Asterisk. Michael's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a fleeting thought. This was a pattern. September 3 RD. Asterisk, I've started keeping a record. Not just of the car but of other things. The way the mail sometimes arrives already opened, subtle signs of disturbance in the house, things moved ever so slightly. My neighbor Deborah thinks I'm imagining things or that it's just the wind. But Deborah doesn't see the shadows I see. She doesn't feel the eyes on her. Asterisk. Michael swallowed hard. Aunt Carol's paranoia wasn't unfounded. It was a response to something real. He continued reading, devouring her words. Each entry a stone laid on a path leading deeper into a dark labyrinth. October 17. Asterisk, I finally confronted the man in the car today. He was just sitting there reading a newspaper. I marched right up to his window. He lowered it slowly. His eyes were cold, like glass. He said he was waiting for a friend. A friend at my house? I said. He just smiled. A chilling, empty smile. I asked him his name. He just drove away. Fast. I think I made a mistake. I think I've shown them I know. Asterisk. A cold knot formed in Michael's stomach. This wasn't a random stalker. This was organized. The journal entries began to focus on Aunt Carol's research. She started spending hours at the local library, poring over old newspaper archives, property records, and obscure local histories. She was looking for something, connecting dots that no one else seemed to see. November 29. Asterisk, it's all connected. The old families, the land grants, the disappearances in the 1950s that were written off as runaways or accidents. The stories my grandmother used to tell, the ones I dismissed as folklore. The whispers about the old society of the Crimson Hand. Not a myth, but a chilling reality. They've been here for generations, quietly pulling strings, accumulating power, controlling everything from the shadows. And they have a secret. A very old secret, tied to this very town, to this very land asterisk. Michael paused. Society of the Crimson Hand? It sounded like something out of a pulp fiction novel, but Carol's tone was deadly serious. He tried to recall if he'd ever heard of such a group, but nothing came to mind. His family had always been fairly ordinary, his father a history buff, but never mentioning anything so outlandish. December 15. I found it. The link. The proof. It's in the old county records, buried deep, disguised as a property transfer. But the names, the dates, it's too precise. A hidden clause. A pact. They weren't just buying land, they were buying silence. They were covering up something monstrous. And it involves the old Miller farm where the well is. The one they sealed off years ago. The one my grandmother warned me about. Asterisk. The Miller farm. Michael knew it. It was just outside of town, an abandoned, overgrown plot of land that locals steered clear of, rumored to be haunted. He remembered driving past it as a kid, feeling an inexplicable unease. January 2 ND. Asterisk. They know I know. The threats are no longer subtle. A broken window, a dead bird on my doorstep. My phone lines are tapped. I can hear the clicks. I'm writing this because I don't know how much time I have left. I've hidden the most crucial piece of evidence. It's in the safety deposit box as planned. The key is with the journal. If anything happens to me, you must take it, Michael. You are the only one left. Don't let them bury the truth with me. Find out what happened at the Miller farm. Be brave. Be smart. Don't let them see you coming. Asterisk. The last entry was dated just 3 days before Michael received the answering machine message. 3 days before Aunt Carol's death. The finality of it hit Michael like a physical blow. She hadn't died of natural causes. She had been silenced. And she had left him a dangerous legacy. He looked around the quiet living room, suddenly seeing its familiar comforts as thin, flimsy shields. The silence wasn't solace. It was the hush before a storm. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Aunt Carol's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk. Don't trust anyone. They are everywhere. Asterisk. He was no longer just listening to a dead relative's message. He was now the target. The terrifying game had begun, and Michael was the unwilling player in a deadly hunt for a truth that someone had killed to keep buried. He had to go to the Miller farm. He had to find that safety deposit box, and he had to do it before they realized he was now involved. Michael didn't waste another second. The gravity of the situation had finally settled, cold and heavy in his gut. This wasn't just about Frank's eccentricities anymore. It was about murder, about a secret so profound it had cost lives. He grabbed his car keys, a powerful LED flashlight, a multi-tool, and an old sturdy baseball bat from the garage, not for offense, he told himself, but for protection, for clearing debris. He also made sure his phone was fully charged, its GPS ready. The Miller farm was a good hour and a half drive out of the city, deep into the rural expanse where cell service could be spotty. The drive was a blur of nervous energy and frantic planning. His mind raced, replaying every conversation, every detail from the answering machine message, every cryptic clue. Uncle Frank, the Millers, the land, the truth. He tried to imagine where Frank, a man who clearly trusted no one with this secret, would hide something so crucial. Not in the house, surely. Too obvious, too easily discovered by anyone else. Maybe the barn? An old shed? A hidden nook in the sprawling, forgotten property? As he left the illuminated sprawl of the city, the darkness of the countryside pressed in, thick and suffocating. The road narrowed, trees formed tunnels overhead, and the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse light only served to emphasize the isolation. He kept checking his rearview mirror, a paranoid habit he couldn't shake, half expecting headlights to materialize from the inky blackness, following him. But there was nothing, only the hum of his engine and the frantic beat of his own heart. Finally, the GPS announced his arrival. The road to the Miller farm was barely more than a gravel track, overgrown with weeds and choked by fallen branches. He pulled off the main road, killing his headlights and coasting slowly down the uneven path, the crunch of gravel under his tires unnaturally loud in the silence. The tree line thickened, swallowing the last vestiges of twilight, plunging the area into near-total darkness. He saw it then, a skeletal silhouette against the barely lighter sky, the farmhouse looming derelict and utterly desolate. He parked his car a good quarter-mile down the track, hidden from the main road by a dense thicket of pines. He didn't want to announce his presence. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. He stepped out, gripping the flashlight and the baseball bat, and the silence that descended was absolute, unnerving. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl made him jump. He began his approach on foot, the beam of his flashlight cutting a nervous swathe through the darkness. The path grew more treacherous, overgrown with thorny bushes and tangled vines. The farmhouse, when he finally reached it, was even more imposing up close. Broken windows stared like vacant eyes, and the porch sagged precariously. The front door hung ajar, revealing a maw of impenetrable darkness within. He pushed the door open further with the tip of his bat, sending a shower of splinters to the floor. The air inside was thick with dust, mildew, and the musty scent of abandonment. He swept his flashlight beam across what must have been the living room. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghostly sentinels. Cobwebs hung like ancient tapestries. This wasn't a place to hide something valuable. Not openly anyway. The house felt ransacked not recently but years ago. Drawers hung open, papers were scattered, and overturned chairs lay like fallen soldiers. Someone had already been through here looking for something. Or perhaps Frank had created this mess himself, a red herring. He moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. He checked under loose floorboards, behind fireplaces, in the back of crumbling closets. Nothing. Just dust, mold, and the ghosts of lives long past. The kitchen was equally desolate, the pantry shelves bare. Upstairs, the bedrooms offered the same grim tableau of decay. He found an old diary, its pages brittle and yellowed, but it belonged to a Sarah Miller and detailed mundane farm life, ending abruptly in the late 1980s. No mention of Frank, no hidden clues. Frustration began to gnaw at him, mixed with a growing sense of dread. The safety deposit box. It wasn't in the house. Frank wouldn't have been so careless, especially given the message's urgency. Frank had said the Miller farm, not the Miller house. That meant the outbuildings, the barn, the shed, the old well. He retreated from the house, pulling the sagging door shut behind him, the creak a jarring sound in the quiet. He looked towards the large, looming silhouette of the barn, 100 yards or so from the house. It was bigger, sturdier, and offered far more nooks and crannies for concealment. It was also, he realized with a chill, an easier place for someone to hide themselves. As he approached the barn, he noticed something. A faint, almost imperceptible disturbance in the overgrown grass near the main entrance. A slight indentation, as if a large vehicle had recently been parked there, just off the gravel path. His heart hammered. He wasn't the first person to come looking since Frank's death. Had they already been here? Had they found it? Or were they still looking? He pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the barn. They groaned on rusted hinges, protesting the intrusion. The interior was cavernous, filled with the scent of old hay, animal musk, and damp wood. The flashlight beam danced across dusty stalls, ancient farming equipment shrouded in cobwebs, and stacks of decaying hay bales that towered like forgotten monuments. This was a far more promising location. Frank had likely spent a lot of time here working, thinking. He started systematically, checking behind every piece of equipment, inside every feed bin, under every loose floorboard. The work was slow, arduous, and physically demanding. He coughed from the dust, his eyes streaming. He moved towards the back of the barn, where a smaller, enclosed room seemed to have been used as a workshop. Tools hung on pegboards, coated in a fine layer of dust. A workbench was cluttered with old jars of nails, rusty screws, and forgotten projects. This felt more like Frank. He could almost picture his uncle here, tinkering, plotting. He began searching the workshop with renewed vigor. He checked under the workbench, behind the tool chest, even inside a rusty old stove that stood in the corner. Nothing. He ran his hand along the rough-hewn wooden walls, feeling for any loose planks, any hidden compartments. His fingers brushed against something, a small, almost invisible seam in the wood, just above shoulder height, partially obscured by a thick layer of grime. He shone his light directly on it. It wasn't a natural seam. It was a faint outline, barely discernible, of a small wooden panel. His heart leaped. This was it. This had to be it. He tried to pry it open with his fingers, but it was stuck fast. He reached for his multi-tool, extending the sturdy blade. With careful pressure, he inserted the blade into the seam and began to work it, slowly, painstakingly. The wood groaned, protesting. A shower of dust and splinters rained down. Finally, with a soft click, the panel gave way. It swung inward, revealing a small, dark cavity behind the wall. He aimed his flashlight into the void. Inside, nestled snugly in the darkness, was a small, worn wooden box. It was old, perhaps a foot long, 6 inches wide, and 4 inches deep, secured with a simple clasp. This wasn't a bank safety deposit box, but a personal strongbox. Frank's strongbox. A wave of adrenaline surged through him, momentarily eclipsing the fear. He reached in, his fingers trembling slightly, and pulled the box out. It was heavier than he expected. He set it down on the workbench, his breath catching in his throat. He fumbled with the clasp. It wasn't locked. It simply unlatched. He took a deep, shaky breath and slowly, deliberately lifted the lid. The contents were not what he expected. No stacks of cash, no precious jewels. Instead, the box contained a thick stack of old legal documents, yellowed with age, secured with a frayed rubber band. On top of the stack lay a single, neatly folded letter, addressed to Michael. And beneath the documents, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was a small, tarnished silver locket. He picked up the letter first, his name scrawled in Frank's familiar, slightly shaky handwriting. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words in the dim light. "Michael," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've listened to my message. I knew they would come for me eventually. I've been living on borrowed time, haunted by what I know, by what they did. The truth about the Miller farm, about what really happened to the family, it's buried deeper than anyone knows. Not just the physical land, but the secret of its value, the reason those powerful men wanted it so badly. I tried to tell people, but they laughed, they threatened. I even tried to expose them, but their reach is long, their influence absolute. I knew I couldn't trust anyone else with this, not even lawyers, not the police. They're too entrenched. You're my last hope, Michael. Your family, and you're stubborn enough to see this through. The documents in this box tell part of the story, but the real key, the final piece of the puzzle, is in the locket. It belonged to Sarah Miller. It holds a hidden clue, a location, a final piece of evidence that will expose everything. Take it to the old abandoned mine shaft entrance, the one near the old railway tracks, about 5 miles east of here. You'll know the spot. There's a marker stone with a fatum carved into it. That's where you'll find what you need. Be careful, Michael. They will stop at nothing to keep this buried. They already killed one man for it, and they won't hesitate to kill again. Your life depends on finding the truth and exposing it before they find you." Michael's hand trembled so violently he almost dropped the letter. Killed one man for it. Frank knew. Frank knew what had happened to Walter Hayes. And now Frank himself was gone. The implication was chilling. Frank wasn't just dead. He had been silenced. He looked at the locket, then back at the letter. The old abandoned mine shaft. 5 miles east. A marker stone with a fatum. This was escalating beyond anything he could have imagined. He was no longer just a curious nephew. He was an active participant, a target. He quickly shuffled through the legal documents. They were old deeds, land surveys, and surprisingly geological reports. Reports that detailed mineral deposits, gold, silver, rare earth elements. The Miller farm wasn't just farmland. It was sitting on a fortune someone had killed for and continued to kill for. A sudden sharp crack echoed from outside the barn. Michael froze, his heart leaping into his throat. It sounded like a branch snapping, but too deliberate, too close. He wasn't alone. Someone was out there. Someone had followed him. Or worse, someone had been waiting. He quickly shoved the letter, the documents, and the locket back into the wooden box, then jammed the box back into its hidden compartment, pushing the panel closed. He had to think. He had to get out. But he couldn't just leave the box. He needed the information. Another sound. A faint scraping like boots on gravel, much closer this time. At the main barn doors. They were coming in. Michael's mind raced. He was trapped. There was no back exit from the workshop. He scanned the room wildly, his flashlight beam frantic. Above him, a small dusty window, high up near the ceiling. Too small to escape through, but maybe. He heard the heavy barn doors creak open again. A sliver of light, not from his flashlight, but from outside, pierced the darkness of the main barn. Headlights, a vehicle, and voices. Low, guttural, too far to make out words, but undeniably human, and undeniably threatening. He had to hide. Now. He had to hide. Now. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through Michael's adrenaline. The main barn was massive, yes, but it was also largely open. A cavernous space filled with shadows that only offered the illusion of concealment. His eyes darted frantically. The old, rusted tractor, half covered in a grimy tarp, offered a bulky silhouette. A stack of ancient hay bales, smelling faintly of dust and decay, formed a precarious wall near the back. And then the loft above, accessible by a rickety wooden ladder. No time. The voices were closer, clearer now. Two men by the sound of it. Deep, rough tones. He scrambled. Not towards the loft, that was too exposed. Not the tractor, too obvious. He threw himself towards the hay bales, not intending to hide behind them, but in them. He clawed at the dry, scratchy fibers, forcing himself into the narrow, dust-choked gap between two particularly large, misshapen bales. It was a tight squeeze, suffocatingly so, and the air was thick with particles that immediately made his nose itch and his throat constrict. He pressed himself against the rough surface, trying to make himself as small as possible, pulling the loose hay around him like a desperate shroud. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, absolute silence of his hiding spot. He could hear his own ragged breathing loud in his ears. He forced himself to slow it, to breathe shallowly, to listen. The scrape of a heavy boot against concrete. A cough. The low mutter of a voice, too indistinct to make out words, but undeniably inside the barn now. They were in. Michael pressed his face into the hay, trying to peer through a tiny crack in the bale, but it was useless. All he saw was a blurred, golden-brown wall of dried grass. He relied on sound. Another heavy boot fall closer. Then a beam of light, not his own focus beam, but a wider, more powerful sweep, cut through the darkness. It danced across the far wall, illuminating the tools hanging there, the cobweb-draped windows, the outline of the old tractor. The light was followed by the distinct crunch of footsteps moving slowly, deliberately, into the barn. "All right, check the perimeter," a gruff voice commanded. Heard a noise. Could be nothing, could be our little friend. Michael froze. Our little friend? Were they talking about him? Had they seen his car? Or known he was coming? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. He hadn't told anyone he was coming to Arthur's. No one. Except Jessica. But she wouldn't. Could she? No, that was absurd. Another voice, slightly higher pitched, responded. "Place is a dump. You really think Arthur would hide anything here? He was always so particular. Arthur was a lot of things, Mark. And he was getting desperate. Desperate men do desperate things. Now search." The names Mark and the other unnamed man gave Michael a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of insight. They knew Arthur. They were looking for something specific. Something Arthur had hidden. And they seemed to think Arthur, in his desperation, might have chosen this decrepit barn. The flashlight beam swept past his hiding spot, a searing white line that sliced through the darkness, dangerously close. Michael squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to be invisible, to be silent. He could feel the vibrations of their footsteps now, growing louder, closer. They were moving deeper into the barn. "Check the loft first," the gruff voice ordered. "Easy access. Easy to stash something small up there." Michael heard the creak of the old wooden ladder. He imagined one of them ascending, the beam of their flashlight cutting through the dust motes in the air. He held his breath, listening to the rhythmic creak, creak, creak of someone climbing. Then a frustrated sigh from above. "Nothing up here, boss. Just more dust and a dead bird. Damn it. All right, Mark, you take the far side. I'll take this side. Look for anything out of place. Loose floorboards, fresh dirt, anything that looks like it's been moved recently. And keep an eye out for our snooping friend." The mention of snooping friend again confirmed it. They knew someone was here or had been here. Michael's presence at the desk, the lockbox, the disturbed dust, it all pointed to him. He was no longer just a curious nephew. He was an obstacle, a threat. He heard them split up, their footsteps diverging. The gruff voice, the boss, seemed to be heading towards Michael's side of the barn, systematically searching. Michael could hear the rustle of old tarps being pulled back, the clatter of metal tools being shifted, the occasional grunt of exertion. Each sound was magnified in his hiding spot, making his nerves fray. He needed to see them. He needed to understand what he was up against. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to shift, trying to create a tiny gap in the hay, just enough to get an eye to. The hay scratched mercilessly at his skin, and the dust made his eyes water, but he persevered. Finally, a sliver. A narrow, blurry view of the barn floor. He could see the boss now. A heavily built man wearing dark work clothes, a worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He moved with a practiced efficiency, his powerful flashlight beam methodically sweeping every surface. He wasn't just glancing, he was searching. Michael could feel the intensity of his gaze even from a distance. The man was getting closer to Michael's location. He was moving towards the back wall, towards the area where the desk was hidden. Michael's heart threatened to burst from his chest. The lockbox. He hadn't opened it. He had left it on the desk, exposed. Anything. Mark's voice echoed from the other side of the barn. Not yet. Just junk. But I've got a feeling, Mark. Arthur was too slick to just leave it out in the open, but he was also too sentimental to get rid of it entirely. It's here. Somewhere. Sentimental? That old man was a menace. Remember what he pulled with a... Mark's voice dropped, becoming an indistinguishable mumble. Michael strained to hear but couldn't. What had Arthur pulled? What were they talking about? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but they were jagged, sharp, and threatening. This wasn't just about an inheritance. This was something darker, something dangerous. The boss was now directly in front of the hidden room, his flashlight beam playing over the rough wooden paneling that concealed the entrance. Michael held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed. He could hear the man's heavy breathing, the faint creak of his leather jacket. Then the man stopped. His flashlight beam narrowed, focusing on a particular spot on the wall, the very spot where Michael had pried open the panel. Well, what do we have here? The boss muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Looks like someone's been busy. Michael's blood ran cold. He had been so careful to replace the panel, but clearly not careful enough. The man reached out, his gloved hand tracing the edge of the disguised door. Michael could hear the slight scrape as the man tested it, pushing at the panel. Mark, get over here. The urgency in the boss's voice was unmistakable. Michael heard Mark's hurried footsteps approaching. He knew he was about to be discovered. He had mere seconds. What could he do? There was no escape from this hay bale. He was trapped. Look at this, the boss said, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. Fresh pry marks. Someone's been poking around Arthur's little secrets. Mark arrived, his voice a low whistle. Damn, you think it's the kid? Who else? He's the only one who'd have a reason to snoop. Arthur's family. Always digging where they don't belong. The boss pushed harder on the panel. It gave way with a soft creak, revealing the dark opening to the small room. Michael could hear his own heart pounding, a frantic, deafening rhythm. He could practically feel their eyes on the hidden room, on the desk, on the lockbox that lay exposed. He had to assume the worst. They would find it. And then they would know. They would know someone was here. Bingo, Mark said, his voice closer now, right outside the hidden room. Looks like our friend was just getting started. Or just finished, the boss corrected, his voice hardening. Check inside, Mark. See what he left for us. And see if there's any sign of him. Michael heard Mark step into the small room. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the desk, the scattered papers, and finally, the small, ornate lockbox. Found it, boss. The lockbox. And it's still locked. A note of disappointment in Mark's voice. Looks like our friend didn't get this far. A wave of relief, so potent it almost made Michael dizzy, washed over him. He hadn't opened it. They didn't know what was inside. Yet. Well, that's something, the boss said, his voice still tense. But he was definitely here, which means he's probably still close. He wouldn't just leave this behind and walk away. Not if he's anything like Arthur. Michael felt a surge of fear again. They knew he was close. They were actively looking for him. He was in their territory, trapped, and they were closing in. All right, Mark, you stay here. See if you can get this thing open. I'm going to sweep the rest of the barn. He can't have gone far. Michael heard Mark grunting as he settled into the small room, presumably at the desk. Then the heavy footsteps of the boss began again, moving away from the hidden room, away from Michael's immediate vicinity, but still in the barn. He was systematically searching, getting closer to Michael's hiding place with every step. The beam of the flashlight flickered through the cracks in the hay bale again, more intensely this time. The boss was directly in front of him, just a few feet away. Michael could hear his breathing, heavy and deliberate. He could smell the faint scent of stale cigarette smoke and damp earth that clung to the man. The man paused. Michael's heart stopped. Was he about to discover him? Was this the end? Then a low growl from the boss. Damn rats. Always nesting in the hay. Think you can hide, do you? Michael heard a rustle, a slight disturbance in the hay, and then a heavy thud. The boss had kicked at the bales, not directly at Michael's hiding spot, but at the ones adjacent, perhaps startling a real rodent. The danger was immediate, palpable. He could feel the warmth of the man's body, the subtle vibration in the ground. He was so close. Michael closed his eyes, willing himself to disappear, to become part of the hay, part of the barn. The boss moved on, his footsteps receding slightly, continuing his methodical search of the barn. Michael let out a silent, shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He was safe for now, but the reprieve was temporary. He was still trapped and they were still here. He heard the distinct sound of metal scraping against metal coming from the hidden room. Mark was working on the lockbox. How much time did he have before they opened it and discovered whatever secrets Arthur had kept hidden? And what would happen to Michael when they did? He had to get out. But how? He was surrounded, exposed, and completely alone. The answering machine message, the strange symbols, the cryptic will. It all led to this moment, to this dangerous encounter in a desolate barn, caught between a dead man's secrets and two very live, very dangerous men. His only option was to wait, to listen, and to pray for an opportunity, however slim, to escape. But even if he escaped, what then? He now knew these men were after something connected to Arthur, and Michael was now inextricably tied to it. The cold seeped into Michael's bones, a relentless, insidious chill that seemed to mock his every attempt at resolve. His only comfort, if it could be called that, was the dull throb from a cut above his eye, a constant reminder of his predicament, a pain that grounded him in the terrifying reality of his situation. He was no longer just a man trying to understand a cryptic message. He was a pawn, trapped in a game he didn't even know the rules to. A game with stakes far higher than anything he could have imagined. Arthur, his quiet, unassuming uncle, had been involved in something truly dangerous, and Michael, by virtue of that answering machine message, had stumbled right into the heart of it. Hours blurred into an agonizing eternity. He tried to mark the passage of time by the infrequent sounds filtering through the concrete walls, the distant rumble of a vehicle, the faint, indistinguishable murmur of voices. His mind, starved for distraction, latched onto every detail, every flicker of light, every change in temperature. He tried to piece together what these men wanted, what Arthur could possibly have possessed that would incite such ruthlessness. Was it money? Information? Some kind of object? The ambiguity was almost as terrifying as the certainty of his capture. The door eventually creaked open again, casting a harsh shaft of light across the grimy floor. Silas, the man with the cold, assessing eyes, stood framed in the doorway, a plate of what looked like stale bread and a plastic cup of water in his hand. He didn't speak, simply set the meager offering on the floor, well within Michael's reach, but far enough to force him to strain. The gesture was both a slight mercy and a calculated act of humiliation. Michael, his stomach aching with hunger, watched him warily. "What do you want from me?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. Silas merely tilted his head, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "You know what we want, Michael. Or at least you know who had it. And now you're involved." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "We're not unreasonable men. We just want what's ours. And Arthur, he got careless." "Careless with what?" Michael pressed, ignoring the bread, trying to glean any scrap of information. "I don't know anything about Arthur's secrets. I just got a message." Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "A message that led you right into his mess. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Almost as if he wanted you to find it. Or perhaps, he wanted us to find you." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over Michael. Think, Michael. Think about what Arthur might have entrusted to you, or where he might have hidden it. What did he value most? What did he protect? Michael's mind raced. Arthur had been a creature of habit, a man who lived a simple life. He hadn't kept many valuables, certainly nothing that would warrant this kind of attention. Unless it wasn't something of monetary value at all. Unless it was something else entirely. The message, the specific words, the tone. It was a warning, yes, but also a plea. Asterisk, they're coming for it. For the truth, star. The truth about what? And what was it that Arthur had hidden somewhere safe, somewhere no one would look? Silas seemed to read the wheels turning in Michael's mind. The longer you delay, Michael, the harder this becomes. Not just for you, but for others. We know about your sister, Emily. A lovely young woman. And your parents, God rest their souls, but their memory might be tarnished, should we not find what we're looking for. A cold dread gripped Michael. They knew about Emily. They knew about his family. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was a direct threat, a chilling reminder of the reach and ruthlessness of these men. He felt a surge of defiant anger, but he knew better than to show it. He needed to think, to protect Emily. I'm telling you, I don't know, Michael insisted, trying to keep his voice steady. If Arthur hid something he didn't tell me, he wouldn't. He was always so private. Silas sighed, a theatrical gesture of impatience. Perhaps. Or perhaps you're simply not remembering clearly enough. The mind can be a tricky thing under duress. We have ways of helping people remember. He turned to leave, the door creaking ominously. Think about it, Michael. Really think. Before we have to get creative. The door slammed shut, plunging Michael back into the suffocating darkness. The stale bread and water lay untouched. He wasn't hungry anymore, just sick to his stomach. Emily. He had to protect Emily. This threat changed everything. He couldn't just wait for an escape. He had to find a way to give them what they wanted, or at least convince them he didn't have it, and then somehow disappear. But what was it? He forced himself to eat a piece of the bread, chewing slowly, trying to concentrate despite the fear gnawing at him. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to visualize Arthur's apartment, every detail he could recall. The dusty books, the worn armchair, the perpetually half-empty coffee mug. Arthur had lived a life of quiet routine. He was a history enthusiast, a collector of antique maps, a man who appreciated the forgotten stories of the past. Could it be something related to that? An old map? A historical document? Michael remembered the specific phrasing of the answering machine message. They're coming for it. For the truth. Not just it, but the truth. This implied something more than a simple object. It implied a secret, a revelation. And then Arthur's desperate plea. Don't let them find it. Don't let them silence the truth. He thought about the cryptic phrase Arthur had used, the one he'd initially dismissed as rambling. Asterisk, the sun rises on the forgotten city, and sets on the forgotten grave. Asterisk, it sounded like something from an old riddle, or a passage from a forgotten text. Arthur had a fascination with local history, particularly the stories of the early settlers, the founding families, the hidden narratives of their town, Blackwood Creek. He had often spouted obscure facts about the old mill, the abandoned mine shafts, the overgrown cemetery on the outskirts of town. Could the forgotten city refer to something local? A lost settlement? A forgotten part of Blackwood Creek's history? And the forgotten grave? That almost certainly pointed to the old cemetery. But what would be hidden there, and why would it be so important? Michael remembered the small, leather-bound journal Arthur always kept by his bedside. He'd seen it many times but never paid it much attention. It was filled with Arthur's meticulous, almost indecipherable handwriting, notes on local folklore, historical anecdotes, and what Michael had always assumed were just random musings. Could that journal hold the key? But he hadn't seen it when he was at Arthur's apartment. He'd been too focused on the message, on the shock of Arthur's death. He replayed the entire sequence of events in his head. The message, the visit to Arthur's apartment, the discovery of the hidden compartment in the desk. He hadn't found anything of significance there, just an old box of photographs and some financial documents. But what if he had missed something? What if Arthur had moved it? A new thought struck him, a chilling possibility. What if Arthur hadn't died of natural causes? What if he'd been murdered, silenced before he could reveal whatever truth he held? The police had ruled it a heart attack, but Michael now saw the events through a different, much darker lens. The urgency in Arthur's voice on the message, the suddenness of his death, the immediate arrival of these men. It all fit. And then there was the second part of the message, the part Michael had struggled to comprehend. Jessica knows. Tell her the owl, the serpent, the key. Jessica. His ex-girlfriend. Why would Arthur mention her? What could she possibly know? He hadn't spoken to Jessica in years. The owl serpent key sounded like a bizarre code, something out of a pulp fiction novel, utterly unlike Arthur. But if Arthur had been murdered, then perhaps this code was a desperate attempt to pass on crucial information to someone he trusted, someone who might understand. And why Jessica? She had always been sharp, analytical, with an interest in puzzles and ancient symbols. Could she decipher it? The thought brought a flicker of desperate hope. If he could somehow reach Jessica, if she knew something, if she could understand Arthur's cryptic message, then there might be a way out of this. But first he had to escape. He began to meticulously examine his surroundings again, not just with the eyes of a terrified captive, but with the focused mind of someone desperate for a solution. The rough concrete walls, the single bare bulb in the ceiling, the heavy steel door. He ran his fingers along the edges of the floor, feeling for any loose tiles, any subtle irregularities. He pressed against the walls, listening for hollow spots, for any hint of a hidden passage. Nothing. The room seemed impenetrable. But then, his gaze fell upon the small, rusted grate high up on one wall, near the ceiling. It was too small for him to fit through, likely just an air vent, but it was there, a break in the uniform concrete. And below it, almost hidden by shadow, was a small, flimsy-looking stool that Silas had used to reach something on a shelf earlier. It was rickety, probably wouldn't hold his weight, but it was an object, a potential tool. He knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but Michael felt a surge of adrenaline. He had to try. For Emily. For Arthur. For the truth. He needed to be patient, to wait for the right moment, for a lapse in their vigilance. He would pretend to be broken, defeated, to lull them into a false sense of security. And then he would make his move. The game was far from over. He just needed one chance. One small opening. And he would take it. He would fight for his freedom, and he would fight for the truth Arthur had died to protect. David's world had shrunk to a concrete box, the clang of metal doors and the constant hum of fluorescent lights replacing the quiet solitude of his apartment. The initial days were a blur of shock and disbelief, a suffocating weight of injustice pressing down on him. He was a man accused of a crime he didn't commit, a pawn in a game he barely understood, holding the key to a truth that had cost his uncle his life. Despair was a tempting surrender, a dark current pulling him under, but then he'd remember Arthur. Remember the frantic urgency in his voice, the plea to expose them. That memory ignited a spark, a fierce protective flame that refused to be extinguished. Arthur hadn't died for nothing. David wouldn't let his legacy be silence. He was assigned a public defender, a weary woman named Sarah Miller, whose eyes held the tired resignation of someone who had seen too many lost causes. David recounted everything from the answering machine message to the hidden file, the sudden police raid, and the impossible accusation. He spoke with a desperate clarity, reliving every detail, every tremor of fear and confusion. Sarah listened patiently, nodding occasionally, her gaze never quite meeting his. When he finished, she sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire justice system. "David," she began, her voice soft but firm, "the prosecution has a strong case. They have your fingerprints on the alleged murder weapon, a kitchen knife from your own home. They have forensic evidence placing Arthur's blood at your apartment. They have a motive, a disputed inheritance, though that's weak. And they have your flight from the scene, which looks incredibly bad." "I didn't flee," David interjected, his voice rising. "I was trying to understand what was happening. I was confused, I was scared. Someone set me up. They planted the evidence." Sarah held up a hand. "I understand that's your story, and we'll present it. But the jury, they're going to see a man who was found at the scene with the victim's blood on his clothes and a weapon with his prints. They'll see a man who ran from the police. It's a tough sell, David. A very tough sell." The words hit him like a physical blow. He was trapped. The system designed to protect was now an impenetrable wall, built by the very people he suspected. He was surrounded, isolated, and the truth was locked away just out of reach. But Arthur's words echoed. Don't trust anyone. And then, you have to expose them. Exposure. That was his only path. But how? From inside these walls? He had to think, to piece together the fragments of Arthur's life, the whispers, the half-finished sentences, the file. The file. He'd barely glimpsed it before the police burst in. Project Chimera. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity. He had heard Arthur mention it once years ago, dismissively, as some old dead-end research project from his early days at the biotech firm Gen X Solutions. But Arthur hadn't been dismissive in his message. He'd been terrified. David spent his nights replaying every interaction with Arthur over the past few months. Arthur had been agitated, distracted, prone to sudden bursts of anger followed by deep silences. He'd been looking over his shoulder, checking his phone constantly. David had dismissed it as Arthur being Arthur, eccentric, a bit paranoid. Now he saw it for what it was. A man living in fear. He remembered a dinner a few weeks before Arthur's death. Arthur had been unusually quiet, picking at his food. Then out of nowhere he'd looked up, his eyes wide, and said, "They're playing God, David. And they don't care who gets hurt." David, absorbed in his own life, had just mumbled something about corporate greed and changed the subject. The guilt was a bitter taste in his mouth. Now those words screamed in his mind. Playing God. What could that mean in the context of a biotech firm? Gen X Solutions. He knew they specialized in genetic research, pharmaceuticals, and agricultural advancements. Could Project Chimera be related to something unethical? Something dangerous? He needed information. He needed to find out what Arthur had been working on, what he had discovered. Sarah Miller was his only link to the outside, but she was focused on legal defense, not conspiracy theories. He couldn't burden her with his wild suspicions without solid proof. He had to find that proof himself. His mind raced, sifting through every memory. Arthur had been meticulous, obsessive about details. He wouldn't have just left the file under a floorboard without some other failsafe, some other way to ensure the truth got out. Where else might he have hidden information? A safety deposit box? A coded message? He remembered Arthur's quirky habits. He loved puzzles, riddles, old-fashioned ciphers. He had a collection of antique typewriters and an anachronistic appreciation for physical mail and landlines. The answering machine. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was Arthur's chosen method of communication, a deliberate act to bypass digital surveillance. What if the message itself contained more than just the obvious? "They're onto me, David. The truth about Project Chimera. It's bigger than I thought. Don't trust anyone." The file. Under the loose floorboard in the study. You have to expose them. He focused on the subtle nuances of Arthur's voice, the slight hesitations, the emphasis on certain words. Bigger than I thought. This implied a discovery that had escalated beyond his initial understanding. Don't trust anyone. This was critical. It meant the danger extended beyond a single individual, perhaps even within institutions Arthur might have once trusted. David needed to get to the file to truly examine it. But it was impounded as evidence. He needed a way to get someone to retrieve a copy or information from it without directly implicating them. He needed someone outside who believed him, someone who wasn't tied to the legal system. His thoughts drifted to Emily, Arthur's niece, his cousin. She had always been close to Arthur, sharing his quirky sense of humor and his love for obscure historical facts. She was intelligent, resourceful, and fiercely loyal. But she lived across the country, and he hadn't spoken to her in months. How could he reach her without raising suspicion? Phone calls were monitored. Letters would be read. He remembered something Arthur had told him once, a family secret, a contingency plan. Arthur, ever the paranoid intellectual, had set up a system years ago, back when he had first started working on sensitive projects. He had an old friend, a retired private investigator named Robert Hayes, who lived in a small, out-of-the-way town in Vermont. Arthur had said, "If I ever disappear, or if anything suspicious happens to me, Robert is the man you need to talk to. He knows where to look, and he's discreet." Arthur had even given him a specific phrase to use, a sort of code word to prove he was genuine. "The owls are not what they seem." It was a silly phrase, a nod to an old TV show they both loved, but it was their secret. Robert Hayes. That was it. He was Arthur's failsafe. But how to contact him? He couldn't just call him from prison and drop a coded phrase. That would flag him immediately. He needed to get a message out to Emily first. She could then contact Robert. But how? He couldn't explicitly ask her to go digging for evidence. That would put her in danger. He had to be subtle coded. Then a memory flashed, a tiny, almost insignificant detail. Arthur had a habit of sending Emily postcards from his travels, even if he wasn't really traveling. He'd just buy a scenic postcard from a local shop and mail it, often with a cryptic message or an inside joke. He'd done it for years. Emily would understand. David knew the prison allowed inmates to send letters, which were, of course, read by staff. But he could use that to his advantage. He would write a seemingly innocuous letter to Emily, expressing his despair, his longing for family, and subtly embed a message within it. He couldn't mention Project Chimera or Robert Hayes directly. He had to rely on Emily's intuition, her understanding of Arthur's peculiar ways. He started drafting the letter in his head, carefully choosing his words. He would talk about missing Arthur, about how he wished he had paid more attention to his uncle's worries and old stories. He would mention a specific, shared memory, a trip they had taken to a remote cabin in the woods where Arthur had once shown them how to identify different owl calls. He would write, "I wish I had listened more closely when Arthur talked about the woods, about how sometimes the owls aren't what they seem, especially around that old oak tree." It was a long shot, but it was all he had. Emily, if she remembered Arthur's fail-safe conversation, might connect the phrase to Robert Hayes. And the old oak tree could be a hint towards a specific location or another clue. He would also include a request for a specific book, a fictional spy novel that Arthur had always loved, one that featured coded messages in its plot. The request would seem innocent enough, a prisoner seeking distraction. But within the book there would be a specific page number, a line that Arthur had always highlighted, that Emily would recognize as a prompt for a deeper look. This was his chance, a fragile thread, woven with hope and desperation. He would rely on Emily's love for Arthur, her sharp mind, and her shared understanding of their uncle's eccentricities. If she picked up on his subtle cues, if she remembered the owl's phrase and the significance of the oak tree, she might just be able to connect with Robert Hayes. And Robert Hayes, Arthur's old friend, was his only hope of exposing Project Chimera and clearing his name. The game was still on, and David, though caged, was ready to play. He just needed Emily to hear his silent plea. He needed her to believe, and he needed her to act. The truth was out there, tangled in a web of lies, and he would fight tooth and nail to unravel it. The chill of David's unspoken plea resonated through Emily's bones, a desperate echo in the silent, sterile halls of the institution. His eyes, wide with a terror that transcended the confines of his supposed madness, had spoken volumes. He wasn't just afraid. He was a prisoner of a truth no one else would acknowledge. And she, Emily, was his last hope. The answering machine message from Michael, her uncle, now pulsed with a renewed, ominous significance in her mind. "They're coming for me, Emily. Don't let them get to David. The will. It's not what it seems. Trust no one. Especially not Jessica." Every word now felt like a direct accusation, a chilling prophecy fulfilled. Jessica. The name hung heavy, a poisoned dart aimed straight for her heart of suspicion. Emily had dismissed it before, rationalizing away Michael's paranoia, attributing it to his failing health. But David's predicament, the orchestrated swiftness of his confinement, Jessica's cold demeanor, her absolute control over every aspect of David's life. It all screamed of a calculated, sinister plot. Emily knew she couldn't waste another second. Her first instinct was to try and see David again, to somehow break through the wall of silence and officialdom. She called the institution, her voice carefully modulated, feigning concern. But the response was immediate, firm, and delivered with a practiced politeness that masked an iron will. "Mr. Miller's visitation privileges are currently restricted to his legal guardian, Ms. Jessica Hayes. We appreciate your understanding." Jessica. Always Jessica. Blocking every avenue, tightening the noose. A cold fury began to simmer within Emily. She wasn't just worried anymore. She was indignant, resolute. Jessica wasn't just a grieving sister-in-law. She was an architect of lies, a captor. Emily knew she couldn't rely on official channels, not when the very system seemed compromised, or at least easily manipulated by Jessica's influence and resources. She had to become her own detective, delve into the shadows, and unearth the truth Michael had hinted at. Where to start? The will. Michael's last testament. It's not what it seems. That was the key. She remembered the lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a man whose stern professionalism had seemed beyond reproach. But what if he too was an unwitting pawn, or worse, complicit? Emily decided to bypass him for now. If Jessica truly was behind this, she would have covered her tracks meticulously. Emily needed to find something raw, something untouched by Jessica's manipulative hands. That left Michael's house. The house where he had lived, where he had made that desperate, prophetic call. It was a long shot. Jessica had likely cleared out anything incriminating, or simply dismissed anything unusual. But Emily remembered Michael's meticulous nature, his penchant for secret spots, for keeping important things close. He was a man who planned, who anticipated. The answering machine message wasn't a random outburst. It was a warning, a breadcrumb trail. Emily still had a spare key to Michael's house, a forgotten relic from happier times when she'd occasionally house-sat for him. It felt like a small victory, a crack in Jessica's fortress. Under the cover of twilight, when the quiet suburban street was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and most neighbors were settled in for the evening, Emily drove to Michael's house. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and determination. This wasn't just about David anymore. It was about Michael, about justice, about exposing a monstrous deception. The house was dark, silent, a mausoleum of forgotten memories. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and absence. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the moonlight filtering through the windows, seemed to amplify her anxiety. Emily moved through the familiar rooms, her flashlight beam dancing across furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts awaiting resurrection. She went straight to Michael's study, his sanctuary, the heart of his intellectual life. The study was exactly as she remembered it. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves overflowing with leather-bound volumes, a massive mahogany desk, and a fireplace that had often roared with warmth during chilly evenings. She ran her hand along the spines of books, her mind racing. Where would Michael hide something truly vital? Not in a desk drawer. Not in an obvious safe. Michael was smarter than that. She remembered Michael's peculiar habit of tapping on the wall behind a specific section of his bookshelf whenever he was deep in thought. It was an unconscious tick, one she'd always found endearing. Now a cold dread crept up her spine. She moved to that section, a heavy, ornate oak bookshelf filled with antique literature. She began to tap, gently at first, then more deliberately, along the wooden paneling behind the books. Most of it was solid, but then a slight change in resonance. A hollow sound. Her breath hitched. This was it. Her fingers traced the outline of a barely perceptible seam in the wood. It wasn't a visible door, but a panel, expertly crafted to blend seamlessly with the rest of the bookshelf. With trembling hands she applied pressure, searching for a latch, a release mechanism. She remembered Michael talking about a subtle pressure point, a specific sequence. She tried pressing certain books, then pushing on the panel itself. Finally, with a soft click, a small section of the bookshelf, perhaps 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, swung inwards, revealing a dark recess. Inside, nestled in the shadows, were 2 items. An old, compact mini-DV video camera, the kind Michael had used to record family holidays years ago, and a thick, sealed manila envelope, conspicuously labeled for Emily, to be opened only if I am no longer able to communicate, or if David is in distress. Her heart leaped into her throat. Michael had known. He had anticipated this. He had trusted her. Emily carefully pulled out the envelope, her fingers almost reverently tracing the bold, familiar handwriting. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the contents in the dim light of her phone's flashlight. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated just 3 days before his supposed heart attack. The words on the page were a torrent of fear, a desperate confession from beyond the grave. Michael wrote of his growing suspicion of Jessica, her insidious presence becoming more pronounced after his initial heart scare. He detailed subtle changes in his medication, unexplained bouts of nausea and weakness that felt more like poisoning than natural decline. He had started to record his symptoms, to document her increasingly aggressive questions about his will, about his assets. He explicitly stated that he believed Jessica was trying to kill him. Her eyes widened, devouring each sentence. "She wants everything, Emily," the letter read. "She has manipulated my existing will, twisting clauses, replacing pages, making it appear as though I've disinherited David in favor of a trust she controls. I suspect she's working with someone else, someone with legal expertise, to make it all appear legitimate. The they from the answering machine message. It wasn't just Jessica. Then came the most chilling revelation. I've made a new legitimate will, hidden in a secure location with a trusted, independent lawyer, Mr. Arthur Jenkins, whom Jessica has no knowledge of. This new will explicitly grants everything to David, with you, Emily, as his co-executor and guardian if anything were to happen to me. But it will only be activated if my death is proven to be anything other than natural causes, or if David is unjustly confined or declared mentally unfit. Michael had even anticipated David's fate. He had seen it coming. The answering machine message, the letter continued, was my failsafe. I recorded that message on a separate, hidden device, set to automatically play on my old answering machine if my home phone line was tampered with, or if I failed to check in at a specific time. It was a desperate cry for help, a coded instruction for you, my dear Emily, to find this very compartment. The message about Jessica and the will was meant to trigger your suspicions, to make you dig deeper to find this. Emily felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The layers of deception, the sheer audacity of Jessica's plan were staggering. But there was more. The letter instructed her to watch the mini DV tape. It's all there, Emily, Michael had written. The proof. Everything I couldn't put into words without risking detection. With trembling hands, Emily fumbled with the old camera. It was battery-powered and miraculously it still had a charge. She inserted the tiny cassette, pressed play, and held the small screen close to her face, the faint glow illuminating her terrified expression. The screen flickered to life. There was Michael looking gaunt, his eyes deeply shadowed, his voice weak but resolute. He sat in his study, in the very chair Emily was now standing near. He began to speak, his words a haunting echo across time. He detailed Jessica's increasing control, her isolation of him, the strange, bitter taste in his morning tea. He even showed a small, unlabeled vial he claimed to have found hidden in Jessica's purse, which he'd had discreetly analyzed, a slow-acting poison, designed to mimic heart failure. Then the most damning evidence. The video showed Michael, using a hidden camera he'd installed, catching Jessica in the act. She was in the kitchen, meticulously crushing a pill into his morning smoothie. Her face, usually so composed, was twisted into a grimace of cold determination. The camera also showed her on the phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, mentioning the lawyer and the amendment to the will. It wasn't Mr. Thompson but a different name, one Emily didn't recognize, but clearly an accomplice. The video ended with Michael, looking directly into the lens, tears welling in his eyes. "If you're watching this, Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "then I'm gone. And David is in danger. She won't stop until she has everything. You must expose her. You must save David. This recording and the new will with Arthur Jenkins, they are the truth. Don't let my death be in vain." The screen went black. Emily stood frozen, the camera clutched in her hand. The truth. It wasn't just tangled in lies. It was buried under a mountain of them. A brutal, calculated murder. A meticulously planned scheme to steal an inheritance and silence anyone who stood in the way. Jessica wasn't just manipulative. She was a murderer. A cold-blooded killer who had poisoned her own brother-in-law, and then framed his son for madness to seize his fortune. The weight of this revelation crashed down on Emily. She had the proof. The undeniable, irrefutable proof. But she was alone in a dark house, holding evidence that could send a powerful, ruthless woman to prison for life. And that woman, Jessica, would stop at nothing to protect her secret. Emily was no longer just a worried niece. She was a witness, a target. The danger was palpable, a chilling presence in the silent room. She had the key to David's freedom, but now she had painted a target squarely on her own back. The game was far from over. It had only just begun. Emily knew the game had just begun because she saw it in Dr. Reed's eyes. A cold, calculated fury that promised swift, brutal retaliation. The air in the office crackled with unspoken threats. Reed's hand twitched towards her desk phone, but Emily was already moving. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat urging her to flee. She bolted for the door, not looking back. The image of Reed's contorted face burned into her memory. She burst into the deserted hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly. She could almost feel Reed's gaze on her back, the silent command to a security detail, or worse, to the shadowy figure who had been tracking her. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced it down, focusing on a single objective: get the flash drive to Agent Miller. The elevator felt like a death trap, too slow, too confined. She opted for the stairwell, her lungs burning as she scrambled down flight after flight. Each creak of the door, each distant sound, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She imagined the fixer, a silent predator already waiting. Reaching the ground floor, she pushed through the heavy exit doors, emerging onto the bustling city street. The late afternoon sun felt blinding, disorienting. She hailed a cab, her voice shaky as she gave Sarah's office address. As the cab pulled away from the curb, Emily risked a glance back at the imposing glass tower of Ethelred Pharmaceuticals. She saw a figure emerge, tall and lean, scanning the street with an unnerving intensity. It was the fixer. He was too far to clearly make out his features, but the predatory stance, the way he seemed to cut through the crowd, left no doubt. He had been activated. The cab ride was a blur of anxiety. Emily clutched the flash drive, a small, unassuming object that held the power to shatter a corporate empire and free her friend. She called Sarah, her voice urgent, breathless. "Sarah, it's Emily. I have it. All of it. I'm on my way to your office. Get Agent Miller there. Now." Sarah's calm voice was a balm, though tinged with concern. "Emily? Are you all right? What happened?" "No time," Emily gasped. "Reed knows. She knows I have the evidence. I think I was followed. Just get Miller there, Sarah. Please." She ended the call, her phone practically vibrating with the frantic beat of her own pulse. She kept an eye on the rearview mirror, but the city traffic was a chaotic labyrinth. She couldn't tell if she was still being pursued. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every stranger a potential enemy. The weight of the flash drive felt immense, a burning coal in her palm. The cab pulled up to Sarah's building. Emily paid the driver in a rush, practically leaping out. She glanced around, her senses heightened, searching for any sign of the fixer. Nothing. The street seemed normal, busy with commuters. She hurried into the lobby, her eyes scanning every face. She didn't trust the quiet. She knew the fixer was methodical, patient. She took the elevator up, her mind racing. What if he was already inside? What if he was waiting for her? The paranoia was a suffocating blanket. When the doors opened, she saw Sarah standing there, her face etched with worry, and beside her Agent Miller, his expression grave but resolute. The sight of them was an immense relief, a small crack of light in the darkness. "Emily!" Sarah rushed forward, pulling her into a tight hug. "Thank God you're okay." "I have it," Emily said, pulling back, her hand trembling slightly as she held out the flash drive to Agent Miller. "This is Richard's data. Everything about Somnus. The clinical trials, the suppressed side effects, the deaths. And George's research. It's all there." Agent Miller took the drive, his gaze intense as he looked at Emily. "You did good, Emily. Very good." He immediately plugged the drive into a laptop Sarah had ready. As the files loaded, he began to scroll, his face hardening with each document he opened. The evidence was irrefutable. Names, dates, internal memos, falsified reports, financial transfers, the entire rotten underbelly of Ethelred Pharmaceuticals cover-up. "This is it," Miller said, his voice low, filled with a grim satisfaction. "This is everything we needed. Dr. Reed, the board members involved, they're finished. And David." He looked at Sarah. "We can move to have all charges against him dropped immediately. This proves he was set up, framed to discredit his reporting." A wave of relief washed over Emily, so profound it nearly buckled her knees. David was free. All the risks, all the terror, all the sleepless nights, it had been worth it. She had done it. She had honored Uncle George's message. But the relief was short-lived. A sudden piercing alarm blared through the office building. A fire alarm. Chaos erupted. People rushed from their offices, confusion and panic on their faces. "What's going on?" Sarah exclaimed, her voice barely audible over the din. Miller's eyes narrowed, a cold certainty in their depths. "It's a diversion. He's here." Emily's blood ran cold. The fixer. He hadn't just followed her. He had orchestrated this. He was making his move. The building was being evacuated. It was the perfect cover for him to get lost in the crowd, or worse, to target them directly in the confusion. "We need to go," Miller commanded, grabbing the laptop and the flash drive. "Stay close." They joined the throng of people descending the stairwell, the alarm blaring relentlessly. Emily's eyes darted through the crowd, searching, her senses on high alert. She saw him. A flash of a dark jacket. A lean figure moving with a disturbing grace against the panicked flow of people. He was coming for them. He was coming for the flash drive. "He's behind us!" Emily shouted, pointing. Miller pushed them forward, urging them to move faster. "He won't get this drive. Not now." They burst out onto the street, where fire trucks were already arriving, lights flashing, sirens wailing. The massive evacuees spilled onto the sidewalks, creating a dense, disoriented crowd. It was a nightmare, perfect for the fixer to disappear or to close in. Suddenly, a hand grabbed Emily's arm from behind, pulling her violently into a narrow alleyway between two buildings. She barely had time to scream before she was slammed against a brick wall, the air knocked out of her. Her assailant was the fixer, his face now visible, utterly devoid of emotion, his eyes like chips of ice. He was taller than she remembered, incredibly strong. "The drive," he growled, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "Where is it?" Emily struggled, terror lending her a desperate strength. "I don't have it," she choked out, trying to kick him. "Miller has it." His grip tightened, cutting off her breath. "Lies." He reached for her bag, tearing it open, emptying its contents onto the grimy alley floor. When he found nothing, his eyes flashed with cold fury. He was about to do something terrible, when a voice boomed from the alley entrance. "FBI! Don't move!" Agent Miller stood there, a firearm leveled at the fixer. Sarah was beside him, her face pale but resolute. The fixer hesitated, his gaze flicking between Emily and Miller, calculating. He knew the game was up. This wasn't a clean snatch and grab anymore. He was exposed. With a sudden, explosive burst of movement, he shoved Emily hard against the wall, using her as a shield for a split second, and then vanished into the maze of the city, melting away into the chaos of the evacuation. Miller fired a shot, but it went wide. The fixer was gone. Emily sagged against the wall, gasping for breath, her body aching but alive. Miller holstered his weapon and rushed to her side. "Are you hurt, Emily?" She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "I'm okay." He didn't get it. The following days were a whirlwind. The evidence on Richard's flash drive was undeniable. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation, leading to the immediate arrest of Dr. Evelyn Reed and several high-ranking executives at Ethelred Pharmaceuticals. The company's stock plummeted, their reputation irrevocably shattered. The truth about Somnus, its deadly side effects, and the ruthless cover-up became front-page news. David was released, his name cleared, his journalistic integrity not only restored but amplified. He immediately began working on an exposé that would rock the pharmaceutical industry to its core, using his own experience and the newly available evidence. He thanked Emily profusely, a silent understanding passing between them, forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. The fixer, however, remained at large for a time, but the net was closing. With Ethelred Pharmaceuticals crumbling and their illegal operations exposed, his network of protection dissolved. Weeks later, news reports confirmed his capture in an abandoned warehouse, a desperate, cornered animal finally brought to justice. Richard, Uncle George's colleague, was eventually located. He had been in hiding, a ghost, terrified for his life. With the arrests of Reed and her accomplices, he cautiously emerged, his testimony further solidifying the case against the pharmaceutical giant. He grieved for George, but found solace in the fact that their shared mission had ultimately succeeded. Emily visited Uncle George's grave, a quiet, solemn pilgrimage. She stood there for a long time, the answering machine message playing in her mind. "Emily, if you're hearing this, it means something went wrong. Don't trust anyone. Find the truth." She had found it. She had honored his memory, avenged his death, and exposed a horrific injustice. The experience had changed her. The quiet, bookish Emily was still there, but now she carried an inner strength, a resilience forged in fire. She understood that sometimes the greatest evils lurked not in shadows, but in plain sight, cloaked in respectability and corporate power. She also understood the immense courage it took to stand against it. As the dust settled, life slowly began to resume a semblance of normalcy, but Emily knew she would never be the same. The echo of Uncle George's voice, the chilling warning, would always be a part of her. It was a reminder that even in death, truth could find a way to speak, and that sometimes a single unexpected message could unravel a conspiracy and bring light to the darkest corners. The game was over and justice finally had won.